Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Perkins, a science writer and press officer at Caltech. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Conversations on Artificial Intelligence. This series is hosted by the Caltech Science Exchange and gives us a chance to hear from scientists and engineers who are working on the cutting edge of AI and machine learning. I'm joined today by two AI researchers, Pietro Perona, who is the Alan E. Puckett Professor of Electrical Engineering at Caltech, and graduate student Suzanne Stefatos, who was a software engineer at Amazon and JPL before coming to Caltech. They're here to talk about AI as a powerful tool for wildlife conservation and biodiversity. Pietro and Suzanne, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
Yes, same. Happy to be here. Hi, Robert.
Hey. So before we get started about applications in ecology, can we talk a little bit about computer vision? What is it, and what are some of the ways in which it's used?
Yeah, so I have an ability. So first of all, hello, everybody. And I have a big advantage in explaining what I do because all of us do it. So all of us, when we open our eyes in the morning, we start seeing the world. And that's what we try to reproduce with computer vision. We want to give machines the same ability that we have to know about the world just by looking. So what are typical things that you do with your visual system? One thing is to understand the geometry of the world that is around you. And so we all have the experience of walking at night in a forest and we trip on roots or we bang our head on a branch. We simply don't see the obstacles that are around us, and we are not able to toss a ball to a friend at night because we don't know how far our friend is. And so we don't know how to dose our toss and in which direction to push the ball. So that's one thing, the geometry. The other thing we do is recognition, and we can categorize objects in the world. So we can see automobiles, cell phones, our keys on a counter, etc. And we know how to interact with objects, and so recognizing them tells us where they are and how do we interact with them best. And part of that is social interactions. And so if I look at you, Robert, I see that you're somewhat paying attention to what I'm saying and you're not too confused. And so our social interactions are also very much reliant on vision, although it's not strictly necessary. So we would like to give machines the ability to see so that they can reproduce all of these abilities that we have.
All right. So as you said, I mean, this is something we do all day long. Why is it something that's so hard for a computer to do? Why is it hard for computers to identify an object just by looking at
it? We have to start with the image. So how do we capture images with our eyes? Our eyes are a fairly complex device. It has a little hole in the front. It's called the pupil. And the eyes that bounces around the world will sometimes enter our pupil all the time, but some rays of light will come into our pupil and will give us information about the world. They will form an image at the back of the eye on the retina, and the same thing happens on a camera. So a camera is very similar to our eye, and there is a chip at the back of the camera that captures these photons that come from the environment. And the count of the photons and their wavelength gives us the amount of brightness and the color of the light. And we have lots of little dots at the back of our eye, the photoreceptors, which are there also on the chip of a camera. And so we end up with a matrix of numbers here and there that tell us how much light there was coming from each one of the directions that we have in front of us. Now, that matrix of numbers is the image, and that's the information we start with. And the trouble is that we have lots of information there, but it's all implicit in the brightness and colors of the image. And so the purpose of vision is to decipher this message that the world is sending to us and make sense of it and construct a model of what is out there in the world. And so from the image, we end up with something in our head, which is a representation of what is out there in the world. And the nature of the two things is very different. And so there is a lot of work to be done to decode what the image is telling us. And it turns out that most, or maybe half of our brain, from the back to here, is dedicated to vision. So we don't realize it, but our brain is working on vision more than it's working on almost anything else, language or proving theorems or whatever else we do during the day.
I think it's also worth mentioning, Pietro alluded to the fact that we create these models, and these models in turn learn things from these images. But if you think about it, humans are this constantly evolving and changing model. So the human brain is sort of like the analogy to a computer vision model. And with age and with time, we learn all these new sensory inputs. And so if you think about it, if you think about having to train a model in computer vision, it doesn't have, or it potentially doesn't have years and years and years of examples to be based off. So if you think about a child, they might, stick their hand on a stove because they don't know that it has a negative reaction. And that negative reaction would be similar to like a loss function in computer vision. And so that's how they learn about the world around them. And we're trying to do the same thing with these computer vision models, is train them to learn about the world, but probably with far fewer images than the human brain has collected.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. All right. Well, how did you become interested in this topic, in computer vision and machine learning in general, and the applications in conservation and ecology?
Mm-hmm. Suzanne, why don't you start?
I can go first. So I came to computer vision through a roundabout path. I studied history as an undergrad at Stanford, and then loved it, but realized I wanted to do something a little bit more impactful. So switched to computer science, which definitely got the itch scratched of how can I do something that immediately affects the world. And then from there, I became a software engineer. But then while I was a software engineer, I wanted to do something a little bit more like socially positive. And I've always been, an avid hiker, sort of drawn to environmental causes. And I started looking up ways to combine computer science and conservation or environmentalism. And I found Pietro's lab, and got very lucky in applying and being accepted to a PhD program. So that's why I'm here.
Right on. Pietro, how about you?
And so for me, the path was a bit more roundabout. I grew up in Italy, where you're surrounded by antiquities and art, and I was always very attracted by art and art history. But then also I wanted to be an engineer, and so it was when I chose my major in college, I was a little bit split between the two, and I ended up choosing engineering. But I was always attracted by images. When I started my PhD at Berkeley, quite a few years ago, I found this new field of computer vision. It was meant to do something completely different, control theory. And then by chance, I met my advisor, who was very young and had been one of the first early people in computer vision, and I was hooked instantly. So the ability to bring this wonderful domain, which is images, under control of mathematics and make it into an engineering problem was very, very interesting. At the time, we didn't know how to tackle any one of the problems that we're working on today, but it was clear to me that it would be a fun thing to do. And so that's how I got hooked. And then our interest in conservation came later, and I can explain it, but it's not very important, I guess. Yeah.
No, I would say you should explain it.
Yeah.
Okay, so here is how it went. So of course, most of us are attracted by nature. When I hike on the Sierras, I'm happy, very happy, and you feel like the world is evolving sometimes in the wrong direction, and so that's a basic feeling that many of us have, that nature is being impacted by human activities and want to help do something to protect it. I came to it in a roundabout way. We were interested in understanding how we can capture what an expert knows about a visual subject, for example, classifying birds or classifying plants or classifying medical images. And how do we take what the expert knows how to do and teach it to the machine so that the machine can help the expert and can help people? And Serge Belongi, who is now a professor in Copenhagen and Cornell, and I, about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, started talking about a concept called Visipedia, which would be the equivalent of Wikipedia, where people, instead of just leaving text into web pages, they leave information about images that they're interested in. And so we looked for a community of experts and practitioners who would benefit from automation and who was already quite sophisticated in putting images online and commenting on the images and sharing images. And we found that birders were the community we're looking for. So we talked to many communities in medicine and other fields, and we found that birders had these beautiful images and they were ready to play ball with us. And so we started helping classify images of birds, and then we expanded this to any plant and animal. And so we'll talk about this maybe in a moment. And the more we worked with these communities that we had started working with just because they were useful to give us interesting data, the more we got hooked on the questions that they were trying to help with. And so conservation and ecology became quite central for us as well. And so we got infected by this passion, and we realized that we could do something positive for the planet. And so we started doing it.
Fantastic. All right. And we'll come back to Visipedia in a sec. Can you tell us a little bit about different ways that AI can help with ecology and conservation, and maybe talk a little bit more about some of the projects you've worked on in that vein?
Suzanne, do you want to start?
Sure. So I can talk about two that I've worked on particularly, and then Pietro, you can talk about another couple that you've worked on. But so I've worked on one project with Pietro's old student, now current professor at MIT, Sarah Thiry, and her incoming student, Justin Kay, and Pietro's other alum, Grant Van Horn. So I work with them on monitoring salmon populations in the Pacific Northwest using sonar imagery. So fisheries throughout Alaska, Washington, California, and Oregon have already started putting sonar cameras in riverbeds to track salmon as they swim from their spawning sites. And they do this for an assortment of reasons. One is environmental, so they want to make sure that climate change and things like dam removal processes and the potential for overfishing aren't affecting salmon populations too much. Another is economic. So Alaska makes probably $1 billion from its fishing industry. And then there's several different stakeholders, as Pietro brings up this slide here. So there's fisheries, there's the tribes themselves, there's other environmentalists, and we've tried to work with a number of them to capture all this data and to capture their needs. But ultimately, so these techs place cameras in riverbeds, and currently they're getting video footage from these cameras and monitoring how many fish swim across the video frame at a time, and then count those as they go, as they swim. And we're just trying to automate that process so that fisheries resources can be alleviated and they can work on other things while we count the fish that swim upstream.
Automatically,
yeah. And so the trick with this is the human system can see like you and I can see the fish as it swims,
right,
pretty easily. But if you look at the video on the left hand side of the screen, you can see shadows behind fish, and that's a remnant of the sonar beams hitting the fish and then bouncing back. And then also the fish themselves aren't necessarily individually identifiable. They all kind of look the same. Their swim pattern is roughly the same. So unlike detecting like a pedestrian versus a car, which are two distinct objects against very distinct backgrounds, these are much more difficult to detect and then track. So re-identify from frame to frame. And so we're working on all sorts of problems around detection, tracking, and then shift in domain. So if we create a computer vision system that can work on one river, it might not work on a different river because of change in riverbed characteristics, change in speckling patterns, change in camera settings themselves. So yeah, a number of difficulties.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. And
So
then
yeah, I was gonna say, so there's another one too?
yeah, so the second one is Sarah Beery and Pietro created a summer workshop hosted at Caltech, and I've contributed to that. So we've created the summer workshop. It's 3 weeks long. It's geared towards PhD and postdoc level ecologists. And so they bring their own data to this workshop that they're trying to work on. And we teach them fundamental computer vision tools so that they can more efficiently and quickly and potentially like gain further insights into their data without having to manually do all of the things that they would normally have to do. So yeah, some of the projects that we worked on, one student wanted to understand how walrus populations are responding to changing Arctic. So they took remote satellite imagery and counted the number of pixels that were off color, so that were brown on sort of a white or blue background. And they used a computer vision approach to do that. That was really key because currently, or at least at the time of the summer school, they didn't have a population census of the number of walruses in the Arctic. So just getting the baseline of what the population is critical to understanding how the population is shifting. And then another project was trying to, just the project below it, use cameras placed in the wild called camera traps. They're stationary, and then they go off whenever motion activates them. So similar to our ring cameras or security cameras that track when motion changes the camera, camera traps also take pictures when animals or plants shift. But she was trying to capture weather patterns using them, which is tricky because they tend not to be like, our phones are really, really high resolution, and camera traps may or may not be this high resolution. And at night, it's difficult to capture that. So she was trying to use computer vision to see if it was raining or snowing or dry.
So it sounds like it's not just about saving grad students' labor, it's also about getting at data we wouldn't otherwise be able to have.
Exactly. So it's saving grad students' labor, but also letting them answer questions that they might not otherwise be able to answer, or approaching the data in a different way, like how to categorize this domain shift pattern, or like sort of teaching them what they may not know. Like questions that they know that they don't know that they don't know, kind of thing.
Excellent, yeah. Excellent. Pietro, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, sure. So just to add something, so Sarah Beery, that was mentioned before, and just graduated from our lab and is going to be a professor next year at MIT. So great satisfaction for our lab to have graduated such a wonderful scientist. And so she participates in putting out camera traps, and we have estimates of how many camera traps are out there to look at wildlife in the world, and to compile census surveys. And it's by some estimates that may be between 100,000 and 1 million. So it's quite clear that no matter how many people are there to look at these pictures, they will only be able to look at a tiny, tiny fraction of these pictures. And so automation is vital to be able to manage and understand these huge data sets. And these huge data sets are the only way we can understand the distribution of species around the world, and we can understand how this distribution is changing vis-a-vis climate, vis-a-vis human impact. There are many other applications that I can mention. So I'll mention a couple, and then I'll show you a couple of slides regarding iNaturalist, which I think is quite fun and people can use. So one application that students developed in one of the classes we teach is detecting and counting illegal gold mines in the Amazon. And so it turns out that illegal gold mines are a big problem because the prospectors will pollute the streams with mercury, which is used for separating the gold from the sand. And they will build roads and take down pieces of forest to be able to operate. And so there are two big impacts on wildlife and the habitat, and also on indigenous tribes, right? And so again, these are huge extensions. The Amazon can only be monitored from a satellite, and we can offer tools to look at these forms of human impact and help governments be on top of what's going on. So that's another one. And then we have JPL nearby. JPL has missions for exploring planet Earth, and they take more images than than the biggest number you have in mind per day. And so again, you need to have automatic analysis for making sense of them. And things like illegal fishing in the Arctic is one thing we are looking at, and we can probably detect these boats in the images that JPL can give us. So let me tell you about something else, which is iNaturalist, and this is something that we really enjoy working on. And so I'll share my screen once again. So iNaturalist is an app that anyone can download to their smart device, and typically people download it to their phone, iPhone and Google phone, whatever you have. And it's an app that was developed by the California Academy of Science. Scott Lowry is the visionary person who thought of this. And his idea was that when we take hikes and we are out in nature and we see a plant or an animal that we would like to know which species is it, and is it a rare species, should it be here at all, and so on. Well, we typically stare at it and we have no idea, okay? And I like picking mushrooms on the Alps, and there are maybe 6 or 7 edible mushrooms I pick up, and for the rest of the mushrooms, I'm always in doubt and I leave them behind and I don't know what they are. And so in many cases, it's very interesting to know, but you don't know it. And so the idea is, using your phone, you can grab a picture of this animal or plant and have your phone directly there classify it for you and suggest a number of species that it could be. And then amongst these, you can choose the one that is most likely to be. And it's a social network, so you can post your observation, and other people who are interested in that species or that location can come in and look at your observations and can contribute their thoughts on which species is it, and then can correct your determination of the species or the machine's determination of the species. Now, the cool thing is, we came in when this iNaturalist had been just launched, and it was not being successful because there were not enough people to help you recognize the species that you're seeing. And so Grant Van Horn, a student who now is a postdoc at Cornell, built a vision system for iNaturalist, which can suggest automatically which species you're looking at. And so, first of all, people can see this, the logo, and they can download it from their app store. And here is an example of a photo I took in Oregon 3 years ago. Somebody was fishing. I took a picture of the animal, and then I asked iNaturalist, what is it? And so automatically, iNaturalist suggested cutthroat trout, okay? And so that's what it suggested, and I posted it. And then a number of people came in, and you will see that iNaturalist says that I'm improving. So iNaturalist knows how much of an expert I am. And improving is an euphemism for I don't know much. And so you shouldn't trust my judgment. Now, somebody else came in, this Van Truan, and said rainbow trout. But you see that he's classified as a maverick, which means somebody who is always shooting their opinion at random and completely unreliable. And then finally, somebody called Lee Kane came in, and somebody else, and he said cutthroat trout, and then somebody else, Bradley Fishes, came in. And these two people are trusted by the system because they've done many correct classifications before. And so finally, the system decided that this was the species. And so from a number of discordant opinions, it pulled out what must be the right classification. And as you can see, there is a green flag saying research grade up in the center of the screen, which means now the system has enough information to decide that cutthroat trout is the correct class. And so this picture will become part of the training set. And so the system can learn from this, and it will do better the next time it finds this kind of image. I hope that this is clear. Now, I want to show an interesting thing, and this was myself taking a hike near Boston a couple of years ago, and I found this interesting pattern on a tree, and somebody had taken it down, but in a way that I had never seen it. So anyway, I wanted to know what tree is this, and I took a photo, and the system told me that it was a beaver. And so here the system is seeing not the animal, but it's seeing the effects of the animal on the environment. And so it could be scat, it could be a feather, and it could be a tree that has been chopped out in a certain way. And since enough people has labeled this kind of images as beaver, then the system knows that a beaver must be the cause or is associated with this kind of picture. And so the system can learn a lot about the environment and can give you hints about species from images this way. And so right now, we're about to hit the goal of 100,000 species of plants and animals that the system can recognize. And long term, we hope to get to 500,000.
Wow. A couple questions about that. How does it know if somebody is a maverick versus somebody who is a more trusted source?
Yes, so that's another piece of Grant Van Horn's thesis. And this is the reason why originally we got involved with these communities. We realized the following fact. If you talk to a doctor or to a birder, they know a lot more than you do, but they're not always an authority on everything that is in their domain. And so a birder who knows all the species in California, you take them to Papua New Guinea or you take them to the Alps, they will not recognize the birds that are there. Or a botanist may not recognize all the plants that are on the Alps because they're trained in California. And the same thing is true for a doctor. Take a radiologist, they may know a lot about the radiology of the liver, but if you show them a picture of bone cancer, they will, roughly know what it is, but they will want to ask a colleague about their thoughts. So what we realized is knowledge is distributed in a community, is not in a single person's head. So if we want the machines to learn to do well in a certain domain, and in this case, it's either birding or species or being a field naturalist, but it could be medicine, then we have to have the machine interact with the community. And the machine has to ask questions from people, and it has to know that nobody is completely trustworthy. Why should, so if it asks Robert Perkins about some plant here on the Sierras, well, why should the machine assume that Robert Perkins knows anything? Robert Perkins may claim that they know, but why? And so the machine learns to develop a social network of trusted people, and each person will be trusted in some subject, but not others. And so we've built behind the scenes a statistical machinery that associates with each person a description of their knowledge and an estimate of how often are they right when they spit out a species identification in a certain domain. And that takes time. So we start off, when a person starts interacting with the system, we don't trust them too much. And then we watch how often are they right and how often they're wrong and in which domain. And we get that from how often do they agree with others. And it turns out that there is this fact of life that typically when people agree, often they're right. And when people are wrong, they often are wrong in different ways. And so that's what the statistical method we use will do. There are many bells and whistles behind the scenes, but this is the top level explanation. I hope it was clear.
Yeah, absolutely. So aside from just being very cool, what sort of applications do you see for this sort of technology?
I'm very curious to see. I think that there are many applications. Whenever communities have knowledge that is specific to images, and so you can think again, there are 5 or 6 branches of medicine. So you think of ophthalmology, radiology, pathology. These are clearly very connected with images. And then, you can have things as simple or as unregimented, if you will, as fashion. Like if somebody will know the name of this style of collar, which is probably different from your collar, and I don't know it. And so there are folksonomies where people taxonomize knowledge in a way that works well within a certain community. And so we would love to be able to help any community that works around images to come together and share their knowledge and create an app that can answer any question about their interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, I'd like to get to questions from the audience, but real quick first, did you want to talk a little bit about the Merlin Bird ID also, or?
Sure. Yes, so it's definitely. So there is another app called Merlin Bird ID, as Robert says, which helps you recognize birds. And it's very similar to iNaturalist that I showed to you, but it's focused on birds specifically. And Grant Van Horn, whom I mentioned earlier, has recently added a song recognition system. So you can turn your app on in your backyard, sit there, be quiet, and turn on Sound ID. And in real time, you will see the system recognizing birds that are chirping away in your backyard by the song. And so I can now recognize birds like the bulbul, which is not a native of California, but has come in, I don't know when. And I had no idea it was there, thanks to this app. Just sitting in my backyard, I thought I heard a strange bird. I turned it on and it was a bulbul, and then birders later confirmed, yes, it's a bulbul. Anyway, so it's a lot of fun, and it almost opens your eyes, metaphorically speaking, to what is around you. It's truly, I find it very fascinating, and so I invite everybody to try it out.
Excellent.
As an engineer too, I'd say they're both iNaturalist and Merlin Bird are really interesting from an engineering perspective, because they take these large models that typically run on GPUs or really, really high energy devices and distill them down into something that can be used on your phone and without internet connection. And these are also problems that we're aware of in like across projects, because usually those are sort of resource constraints for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is the app, Merlin Bird ID. I don't know if people can see it. And so I want to make a little infomercial. I was drinking from this mug serendipitously. We have an institute at Caltech, the Resnick Institute for Sustainability, which funds many of these activities and many of our colleagues at Caltech. So Caltech, as of a couple of years ago, has become a world center for sustainability in many different domains beyond AI.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Real quick, let's turn to questions from the audience, because we've gotten a number of questions so far. So first of all, what has been the most unexpected or surprising thing for you about this work?
Suzanne.
Me? Okay, so I think it's a positive surprise. I think academia has a big reputation of being kind of cutthroat, like people may want to hide their research until it's published. And this community within academia has been exceptionally collaborative and very welcoming, which I found surprising and positively delightful. Also, like it's typical to develop something for one application and then have it not work on another application, and then that divide or that shift is a research question in and of itself, which is really cool.
Excellent.
Pietro.
Yeah, for me, well, one surprise, I've worked in this field for a long time, and so I was used to thinking that, yes, one day we will get to something that works and is useful, but God knows when it will be. And now we have systems that work and are useful. And the big surprise for me was that around 2017, 2018, our systems became better than human experts, both in terms of accuracy and in terms of how many species they can recognize. That really blows my mind that a machine can do what it can do now. And the fact that as the system becomes useful, we can get in touch with lots of possible users. And so Suzanne was mentioning Fish and Game Department in Alaska, tribes in Washington State. We have biologists who are out in Africa. And it's breathtaking how many people we are helping and how much we are learning outside our field that keeps us, happy and interested in our work.
Excellent. All right. As this technology improves, we should also think about potential ethical and privacy concerns, especially with things like facial recognition. In the course of doing this, have you run into any tricky questions, any issues?
Yeah, it's something that we think about, and in fact, I am active also in this area. And so there are 2 or 3 different concerns that people have concerning, regarding AI. One you mentioned, it is privacy. So you can imagine that, so I should say face recognition, whether you like it or not, is as successful as the applications that we were talking about. And so a system to recognize faces is much more accurate than any human could ever be, right? And so, so it's a wonderful tool. For example, in the US, there have been reports by the National Academy of Science on how often eyewitnesses in a crime make the wrong identification, and people end up in jail due to racial prejudice and whatnot. Just, the witnesses say, oh, it was that person. So it's really good to have something that is better than humans and something that you can test for things like prejudice or bias, and you can know if the system is biased or not, and if it is, you can fix it. And so the hope is to have systems that help us have a more just society, one that works better. But definitely they can be misused. So you can think of privacy, like you go and demonstrate against the government, which is something that is very important. And what if the police is filming the crowd and recognizing everybody who went? Like, they cannot charge you because you're exercising your civil rights, but it may have a chilling effect. Mm-hmm. You may not want to be recognized. So we need regulation for this kind of applications, and I think that governments are talking about it. So I see that it's happening, and the issues are very clear. So it's going to be possible to have good laws, I think. So anyway, that's one concern, privacy. Another one I mentioned is bias. So it could be that the systems are biased and we don't know it. And so luckily, the situation is better than with humans. Humans truly are biased and we don't know it and we cannot fix it. While systems, we can measure them and we can fix them, as I was saying before. So that's good.
I think that another interesting application that's particular to conservation is these camera traps. Like Sarah has set out a number of camera traps in Africa and in rural communities where poaching is prevalent. Mm-hmm. And so there's this question of, should something be done if a camera trap sees a poacher, or should it recognize a poacher? And then there's a flip side to it of, is that the responsibility of the computer vision researcher, or like whose responsibility is that to recognize that? And how is that best addressed? And that question is definitely not best addressed by the computer vision researcher. But yeah, like things like that to keep into consideration. And then also like things like geolocations, especially when you're dealing with species that are going extinct. You don't want to publish their exact GPS coordinates, because if this data is being released, then opportunists can take it and say, oh, I can find a rhino at this exact location. So we have to make sure that aspects of the data are fuzzed or not accessible.
Yeah. Seems like another place where policy hasn't quite caught up with technology.
Well, it's catching up. I mean, technology is developing fast, and I think we need to. So we practitioners in the field cannot also decide how the technology is going to be used. So we know the techniques, but society has to decide, right? So there are two different agents here. Society has to decide what's a trade-off between different benefits and possible costs. And so our job is, like we are doing now, to talk to the public, inform the public as much as possible, explain things, and then the public has the time to digest and decide how to do it.
Gotcha.
So an example, again, of loss of privacy was the January 6th uprising in the Capitol a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
And many of those people were recognized from video, from using computer vision. So clearly they were not happy. Now, was that a good use or a bad use of the technology? And so society has to decide if that was a good use or not, and there has to be a discussion. So as these cases come up, we should keep monitoring and being ready to answer questions from since we know how they work.
I've got a question I think is aimed at Suzanne. Suzanne, do you have any advice for somebody who's interested in this line of work and wants to get into this field? How do you break into this?
Yeah, so the way I did it was I blast emailed a bunch of professors working in this kind of space. So there's something called Computational Sustainability, which has a network of not just computer vision researchers, but other sort of computer science computational sustainability problems. So you could do that. You could just Google computational sustainability network, and that'll come up. We also have a Slack called AI for Conservation, created by Sarah, which has over 1,000 people, both within ecology, like on both sides, on the ecology side and on the engineering side. And they're across all walks of life, like hobbyists to engineers to researchers, to just people who want to learn more about the space. So I think that's probably, I'd say, the best place to sort of get enmeshed in this community. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, also feel free to reach out to us afterwards.
Excellent. All right. And I think we've got time for about maybe one more question. Can you each talk about any other applications you're excited about for computer vision?
Suzanne.
I can go first. So yeah. ChatGPT, which is like this new AI engine that's mostly built on language, has become largely well known across a lot of my friends, at least. And so it's really fun that they now know some little part about what AI can do. And so I'm interested in, back in 2012, there was this shift from sort of machine learning as itself to deep learning and the introduction of deep learning into the space. And people are sort of seeing things like ChatGPT, generative AI, as another sort of shift in the space. And so I'm very curious to see how techniques from that realm can be applied to computer vision problems, specifically dealing with our fish and with other naturalist images.
Excellent. All right, and Pietro?
Well, there are so many, but so I'll mention one. Being at Caltech, I interact a lot with my colleagues in the sciences. And so helping automate some processes in science is really wonderful. So I'm collaborating with colleagues in neuroscience who look at the behavior of lab animals, of mice, for example, and they try to understand social behavior and emotion-driven social behavior in animals. And there is this whole question of how genes build networks of neurons in the brain and how networks of neurons regulate behavior, and then in turn how behavior will help nature select some genes. And so understanding behavior autonomous behavior is really interesting. Why does an animal do what it does, and how does it do it, and how does it think about it, and how does it make decisions? And so here vision comes into the picture, as it were, in two ways. One is we build systems for watching the animals and decoding their behavior and telling the scientist, okay, the animals now are fighting, or they're exploring, or they're grooming. And then the second one is, as engineers, we can put on our engineering hat and we could say, well, if I had to build an animal that is able to navigate in a complex environment in the same way as a mouse does in search for food, for example, how would I do it? How would I use vision to navigate? and how would I remember my path? How would I plan my path and avoid obstacles? And so we can give our friends in biology some thoughts on what the brain might be doing so that they can check and test the mechanisms in the brain that they're studying and verify or test some theories that we may propose to them. So it's a very rich environment to work in.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you, Pietro and Suzanne, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
To learn more about future Caltech public events online and in person, please visit events.caltech.edu, where you can sign up for a monthly events newsletter. And in the meantime, you can learn more about artificial intelligence on the Caltech Science Exchange at scienceexchange.caltech.edu. And that's it for today. Thanks for being here, everybody.